Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
We were looking in the last episode at the perfect couple, as we refer to them, Adam and Eve, and the beginning of creation. This is the first murder, but who, Mike, are we talking about? Who's involved?
We're talking here about Adam and Eve's first two sons, Cain and Abel. And that's where this first murder is going to come into the story.
Nowadays, we are more than aware of murders, the reality of them, and even in entertainment, in terms of whodunits and all the rest of it. But this is the story of the first murder as the Bible portrays it. So give us the background.
Yeah, and just as you say that, David, it strikes me what an incredible surprise this must have been. As you say, murder, sadly, we become so familiar with it, don't we? It's often in news items, tragic stories. We perhaps become a bit desensitized to it because, we watch our favourite TV detective story, don't we? And murder is dealt with there. So for us, it's become part and parcel of life. But even as you ask that question, it just impacts me to think, wow, how much of a surprise this must have been the first time this thing ever happened in the human race. It must have been a huge surprise certainly for the parents, for Adam and Eve, whose sons brought this about. Here's a little surprise as we get into the story of Genesis chapter 4, because chapter 3 we saw in our previous episode ended on such a sad point as the perfect couple's relationship begins to crumble, both in the relationship between them and between God, to the point where God has to cast them out of the Garden of Eden into the wider world that he has made. And, we might almost expect that the story went on to say, well, that didn't work, did it? And off they go. But no, God doesn't give up on them. So the very first surprise that comes out in this story is that chapter 4 opens with the words that Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. And she said, with the help of the Lord. That's interesting, isn't it? With the help of the Lord, I've brought forth a man. And later she gave birth to his brother Abel. So, surprise number one in this story, God is a God who doesn't give up on people. I love that. We see this again and again in the Bible's story, how despite human folly, despite human disobedience, God, by his gracious, loving nature, doesn't give up on people. And his plan for the human race, we saw back in chapters 1 and 2, was for the human race to fill the whole earth and be his representatives here on earth and to rule the earth on his part. He doesn't give up on that. He lets Adam and Eve have their first children. Wow, what a surprise, because they certainly didn't deserve that. So we get these two brothers who grow up in very different ways. It's interesting. Abel, we read, kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. So one looked after fields, one looked after animals. So they become very different characters, and it will be, in a sense, out of those different characters and expressions of who they are and their lifestyles and work that the first tragedy will come along.
You sometimes hear people talk about peas in a pod, but though they were the sons, they were different. They had, as you say, different responsibilities, actually, and grew up with different experiences. So what then happened?
Well, it was out of their very different lifestyles, characters, interests that the story goes wrong. We read in chapter 4 that it simply says, in the course of time. So we're not given a time scale for these early chapters, but clearly the boys have grown up now. They're taking responsibilities for life. We read that Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. So he brought some crops that he had grown, while Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. So each are bringing the fruits of their labors. One brings crops, fruit. One brings the firstborn of his animals as a sacrifice. And we read this, I mean, to be honest, this seems to come to us as readers as a bit of a surprise. We read that the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So you think, hang on, God, this seems a bit of favoritism going on here, isn't it? Why have you accepted one guy's offerings and not the other? You know, they both brought you something. It's like they're both wanting to honor you in some way. So here's a surprise. Why do you accept one and not the other? Now, there's a couple of possible reasons. It may have been because of what was offered, or it may have been because of how it was offered. Now, the what was offered, Abel clearly offered his best. The text says he brought the best portions of his firstborn lambs. Firstborn, of course, hey, the whole point of firstborn animals is they are the most precious because, you know, here's the first lamb that's born, but supposing it doesn't bring any more, then what? So you're risking it, aren't you? So there's an element of sacrifice, risk here in offering firstborn, which is why when the law will come along, it will call for the firstborn to be given. You're risking it. And he brings the best portions of it, or the fat portions. Those are the bits that were seen as most precious in the ancient world, while Cain simply brings along some of the fruits of the soil. So was it the what that marked them out? The one brings the best. He risks it. This is, oh God, you know, I'm giving you the firstborn animal here. If you don't give me any more, now I'm sunk. The other brings some, just some of his farm produce. So it may have been the what, or it may have been the why and the how, because of Cain's attitude and his own unawareness of his own heart. As we read on in the story, we read that the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Why are you angry? He gets angry because God accepts his brother's sacrifice and not his. So immediately, hey, here's something we do in today's world, isn't it? Setting ourselves up against God, over God. Deciding, I know what is right. Doesn't matter what you think, God. Doesn't matter what you say. We might say today, doesn't matter what you say in your world. We know what is best. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? So God saw something going on in his heart here. Actually, it seems that it wasn't anything at all to do with the what. The what simply revealed the how and the why of what was going on. And here again is a surprise to us that will come out again and again in the Bible, that God sees in our hearts. God sees what's going on. And then he goes on to say, if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. So God is aware here that something is going on in his heart, and that which is going on is in real danger of opening the door to sin and to even more wrongdoing, which of course it will do. So here's, if you like, a little warning from God. So the way God responds, yes, it could have been because of the what, but I think it's the what reveals the why, what was going on in people's hearts, and from this early stage reveals, hey, it's not what we bring it, it's why we bring it and how we bring it that matters to God.
When you mentioned just now the firstborn, that Abel brought the firstborn lamb, my mind flicked to a famous verse, John 3:16, that you sometimes see at railway stations and beside the motorway, which said, God gave his son. Yeah. Is there any kind of link or parallel there, do you think?
Yes, I think there is. God gave the best that he could give.
His only son.
His only son. In fact, in John 3:16, God gave his, well, the old King James Version used to say he gave his only begotten son, his, in Greek, monogenes son. It probably means one and only, unique. He had no other. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, co-equal parts of the one God, and yet God the Father was willing to give his one and only, his very best, his choice. That's how much God loved us. So absolutely a parallel there, and a little early glimpse into what we will see later in the Bible story.
So you've hinted that Cain's reaction had consequences.
Yes, it did. And as so often happens in these stories, the consequences end up falling on the innocent. That's what sin does, doesn't it? It will fall on the innocent before it falls on the guilty, because clearly, there's something gets stirred up in Cain's heart at, how can I put it, at being told off. I think, if we're honest, none of us like being told off, pulled up, do we? The manager calls us into the office and maybe justly and rightly challenges us with something. The head teacher calls us in, the boss calls us in, and there's something that reacts. It's not just our children who react when we as parents tell our kids off. We as adults can do the same. And that certainly happens here with Cain, because it seems he hatches a plan. And while we are not given an insight into what went on, we go on to read, now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out into the field. Why? Because while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Now, we don't get a sense there of this being like we see on some of the dramas we were talking about earlier on TV, of it being a heat of the moment thing, a heated argument, and the brothers got arguing about, well, why didn't God accept my sacrifice? And they end up fighting and him picking up a stone and killing him. This looks like it was deliberate.
Premeditated.
Absolutely. Premeditated murder, not just manslaughter. This is murder. Let's go out. And while he's out there, he kills him. So, wow, here's the surprise. God had created human beings with every possible advantage to be like him, to know him, to be in his image. He'd given them all that they needed. And yet, once Adam and Eve had opened that door to sin, to not doing things God's way, something has come in that from chapter 4 onwards, and we'll see in the coming chapters, spreads through the whole of the human race. And something got into Cain's heart. He does not like being told that what he did was not acceptable, was not the best. And there is a reaction within him that leads to the surprise of this first murder.
Because obviously it could have gone several ways. He's, to say the least, overstepped the mark, but he could have held back. He could have had a discussion with his brother about it all.
Yeah, he could. I mean, he could have even had a discussion with God, couldn't he? And said to God, so God, why is it that you accepted his and not mine? And could have heard, well, actually, come on, can you see what was going on here? He brought the best, you just brought me some. I don't think it's what sometimes people have thought, that it's like the blood sacrifice and the smell of it going up and pleasing God. That's really much more a pagan type picture. I think it's to do with God seeing what was in his heart. And if only he'd had a discussion, not so much with Abel, but with God about why. And here's the great thing we see in the Bible, by the way. At any time we can go to God and talk to him about anything, including our frustrations, our disappointments. There'll be lots of people in the Bible, lots of the prophets who go to God and ask why. The prophet Habakkuk, his prophetic book is just a whole series of questions of saying to God, why? And God giving him an answer and him following it up with yet more questions. So if only Cain had gone and said to God, why? Could you explain this to me? Could I learn out of this? How many of us fail to learn out of those times when we're challenged about something, when we're brought up? There's something again within us that reacts and goes all huffy, isn't it? Oh, well, in that case. And if only he'd done that, this whole story and the story of the human race that unfolds from this may have been very different indeed.
So he should have slept on it.
Oh, I think absolutely. That's always a wise word, isn't it? Particularly in marriages. Sleep on it, talk about it the next day. But this guy didn't.
And there were consequences, of course, for his brother. What about the consequences for him?
Yes, when we do what's wrong, we might think that they have got their deserts. Now, it may not be murder, it may be some words we spoke, some action we took, but God is a God of justice, and what goes around comes around, if I can put it that way. And so God confronts Cain with what he's done. What I love about this story is the way that God confronts him, because he does not come onto the scene saying, right, now, I've seen from heaven what you have done and you are in big trouble, boy. It's just beautiful the way it happens. We read in chapter 4 and verse 9, the Lord said to Cain, where is your brother, Abel? Now, that's not because God didn't know. I've lost him for a minute, God knows everything that's going on. Clearly, this was an invitational question. It was come on, Cain, we both know what's gone on here, don't we? And if only he had responded, Lord, I am so sorry. I messed up. Because we see that again and again in the Bible story. When people mess up, if they will confess it quickly, God can always forgive quickly and redeem and restore. But when people try and cover up, that's when things go wrong. And the answer that Cain gives to God is, it's almost insulting. It's almost blasphemous when he says, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? Those well-known words. Like, what's that to do with me? Of course, he knew exactly what had happened. And now, having failed God's invitation to come clean about his sin and find forgiveness, God puts his finger on the issue. What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you're under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. So there's double consequences here. First, there's going to be a consequence for Cain himself. He now comes under not the blessing of God, but the curse of God. Curse is the very opposite of blessing. I cannot bless this sort of attitude. You've put yourself now under curse rather than blessing. And not only that, but the very land that he worked. Remember, it was from the land that he brought his offering. The very land that he worked now would become hard to work. This again is the outworking of sin, not just in the human race, but in the created order. And it's interesting. I mean, these days we see more and more, don't we? And non-Christians might not call it sin, but they see the consequences of human stupidity and wrong action in destroying this world of ours. And it goes right back to here. Even in the Garden of Eden, God had told Adam that work would now become hard. Work itself was good. It was a gift of God, but the working of the ground would become hard. Now, that's reinforced. Cain is told that the working of the ground will be hard. It will no longer yield its crops for you in the way that it did. And you will be a restless wanderer on the earth. There'll be something inside you now that can never find, in inverted commas, home. Because you've broken something, Cain. You've destroyed something. You know, and even as I say those words, it may well be that someone listening to our episode today might just be impacted by those words, restless wanderer. You've never found home. You've never found a place where you fit. And I don't just mean living in this street or that street, but deep inside you know you've never found home. And, you know, the only time we really find home is when we come to the living God through Jesus and find the God who created us and find what he created us for and share our lives with him. And even today, it is possible to stop being a restless wanderer. You know, and the UCB website's got just some great resources that people can go to find out how they could come into a relationship with this God so they are no longer the restless wanderer that Cain ended up becoming that day because of how he turned from God.
The consequences for Cain could have been so different. I mean, punishment could have meant capital punishment. God could have taken his life.
Absolutely. And here again is the grace of God. It's another one of the surprises in this story, really. God would have been fully in his rights to say, you've shed blood, I'm now going to take yours. Of course, that wouldn't have helped, particularly with God's plan of wanting to fill the whole earth. And so the punishment God puts on him is somewhat different. It's interesting, Cain will respond to God and says, my punishment is more than I can bear. Wow, that's fascinating because it shows he understood what the removal of God's blessing meant for his life. It's more than he can bear. He says, you're driving me from the land. I'll be hidden from your presence. Oh, wow. He understood this meant no access to God like he used to have, and I'll be a restless wanderer on the earth. And he says, whoever finds me will kill me. Now, that's interesting because, you know, the earth's not fully populated yet, so he's looking ahead there to more as the human race will grow and develop and realizing that there will still be enough of God's fingerprints in the human race for them to have understood that brutal murder like this was wrong and he deserves punishment. And here's the grace of God again. He says, no, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. He says, the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him will kill him. Now, before you ask me, I don't know what the mark was and how it looked, but there was something he put on him that marked him out as this man's punishment is not to be that his life is taken from him, but is to live with what he has done. Now, I think we know enough of God from the Bible to know that this is not God wanting sort of endless punishment. I think God wanted that mark, whatever it was, left there to be a constant reminder to Cain that on his own he could not do this, and the only way he would ever get free from that was by coming back to God. But for the moment, he goes off from the Lord's presence, lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. The great thing is there's another surprise that follows because, I mean, I imagine poor old Adam and Eve, because we often forget them, don't we, in this story? They've now lost one of their two sons. Any parent who has tragically lost a child will understand the pain at this point of what they must have been going through. And yet God has a surprise for them, because they will have more children. Cain will go on to have children himself. But at the end of chapter 4, we read that Adam lay with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth as a replacement. There's the kindness of God to them, the kindness to Cain, in that, he doesn't take his life, but he allows him still to be part of this plan of filling the whole earth with his representatives.
And when you mentioned the mark on Cain, it was obviously a reminder to Cain, for sure, though he would never surely forget, but also maybe a reminder to everyone else that saw that mark, whatever it was, that in a sense the bar had sadly been set for generations to follow.
Yes, I think that's a good point, David. It's a reminder to others. It's a reminder to others of God's standards, of what happens when we don't respond to God's standards. I find the chapters that follow chapter 4 fascinating, and they're often chapters that Christians skim over when they're reading the Bible. Let's get to Noah's story now. But what we find, particularly at the end of chapter 4, is the human race at its best and at its worst. And this is a microcosm of what the human race is like. So we will find good things happening as the human race develops. We find at the end of chapter 4, family life develops, music and technology develop, people start calling out to God. But on the flip side, we find bad things happening. We've got this murder. We've got this strange breed of people called the Nephilim, who may well have been a godless group of people who intermarried with the godly. We find that the human race steadily gets worse and turns away from God, which will lead to the Noah story. So we see a mixture of the human race at its best and at its worst. In a sense, what we've seen in chapter 4. We've seen the human race at its best in Abel. We've seen it at its worst in Cain. And we only have to look round today, don't we, to the world to see the human race is capable of incredible acts of kindness, generosity, sacrifice, and at the same time of incredible cruelty and selfishness. It all comes down to choice, what we will do with the moral choice that we have been given. And Cain and Abel are a little microcosm of that bigger picture that unfolds in the chapters that follow.
So in conclusion, we've been talking about the first murder. That implies there were others to come.
Yes, chapter 4 will end with talking about how the descendants of Cain will develop, how he has a son called Enoch, who has a son called Irad, who has a son called Mehujael, who has a son called Methushael, who has a son called Lamech. And at that point, we get this little refrain. It's put as almost a song at the end of chapter 4, so it obviously became well known, where Lamech said to his wife, Ada and Zillah, his two wives, listen to me, wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech is avenged 77 times. And here's this sort of vicious pronouncement of revenge. So Cain has clearly sown something into the human race here that will multiply even there in his descendants, where it's not just life for life, but life for I'll take 77 of yours. And we're getting a hint here of the deterioration of the human race that will follow in the succeeding chapters, that will lead God to come to the point in the story of Noah that things have got so bad that here's the next surprise. he will have to start all over again.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.